So why don't we kind of start off with kind of separating the concepts of CeFi and DeFi for everybody. What do we mean when we talk about centralized finance versus decentralized finance? You can take that.
So when I say TradFi, I mean banks and large asset managers that everyone's familiar with. When I say CeFi, I really mean the 2.5 or people who create the on-ramps for traditional people to access DeFi. And DeFi is the permissionless protocols where rules of engagement and asset ownership are embedded into the platforms itself, allowing users to actually own and profit from their own data or assets. That's what DeFi is to me.
But what has been the kind of difference, I guess, between the two in the last few months then? Like Mary Catherine, what have you been seeing as the difference between how CeFi has performed and DeFi has performed? Because it really has been a tale of two sides in both halves of this crypto winter.
So CeFi or centralized platforms have completely different infrastructure, completely different operating models. So for example, when you have a crazy trading day or high volume trading day in a TradFi institution, you can feel it on a trading floor. You have people monitoring all the exceptions, you have lots of different systems that have to be working at a different level in concert together, and you have obviously humans ultimately making decisions. CeFi is only one step further from that. It's kind of the same infrastructure, just for digital assets. So elements of it, some intermediaries may be removed. But then in DeFi, for example, at Uniswap, we have a $7 billion trading day in the Uniswap protocol or a $500 million trading day. There's no difference. And it also has no impact in Uniswap Labs. So the protocols operate autonomously. They are self-executing smart contracts. And so some of the market activity or the volatility doesn't necessarily affect the infrastructure. And what we've seen in the past few months is that infrastructure has been robust in many cases, not all cases. It means you have to have really robust smart contracts. That means auditing. That means the best developers. That means battle testing them before you deploy them. I don't want to pretend that all teams necessarily employ those same practices just because they're DeFi. And the second element that I think is really critical in DeFi, that's part of why some things like Uniswap or some of the lending protocols have performed really well over the past few months, is that the critical decisions, whether that's adding new fee tiers or setting rates, are determined by the token holders or decentralized participants in that ecosystem. And so you're not dependent on human decisions. So that fundamental difference in the infrastructure, in the way that, in the operating model is part of why we've seen some of these DeFi protocols perform very differently than CeFi, which ultimately are managing balance sheets and managing risk.
Yeah.
And so some of the failures and the problems we've seen, as I think this audience is probably very aware, were a matter of risk management and failed risk management. Whereas in contrast in DeFi, we've seen new technology models stand up and perform.
Okay, but then also within DeFi, some of those new technology models have not stood up and performed, Terra and Luna being the key cases in point there. Matt, why don't you tell us a bit about...
I think that in part that was also a matter of risk and risk management, not necessarily the technology. So I think it's important, not all DeFi protocols are designed in a way that may perform in a downturn, right? And so it's critical that people do their own diligence to understand what risk they're really taking.
Sure, but with the mechanics of UST and Luna, that was an element of bad engineering, right? That is surely the given at this point.
And I usually like to say it's a tale of two cities, right? But I think the last 6 months in DeFi has been the good, the bad, and the ugly. And just kind of going in reverse order, the ugly was Luna, right? And this is a dynamic that lots of DeFi builders are trying to figure out, which is what are the incentives and ways to attract liquidity to their protocol. And it was a failed experiment, massive failure, and especially in a down market. So these things get pressure tested every now and then. Right now, DeFi is about 80 billion in market value. These chains will be securing tens of trillions of dollars of value. And so this is, on one hand, a lot of people lost money with Luna. It was a bad crypto economic and bad model that was pressure tested and failed. That's important, that failure is important in the totality of DeFi to be successful. 10 years from now, we'll look at it as kind of rounding error in a way, but it's still today, it's profound, it hits hard, and it kind of shakes the industry. So that was definitely the ugly, which then started to play into the bad, which is what we were talking about on the TradeFi centralized finance piece, which valuations went down, balance sheets got tested, and we see now bad risk management in CeFi, which is very different than decentralized finance. So these are basically trading desks that will lend you an LTV of X and standard dynamics in the zip code. The assets people had were extremely volatile, and so when prices dipped, margins and loans were called, and the emperor had no clothes. And so then you kind of look at, so that was ugly, that was bad, and now the good. And so the good is DeFi has worked as programmed in the best way possible, meaning even today on some of these liquidations with Three Arrows and others, they are executing their liquidations on DeFi because there's no lawyer, there's no credit committee, there's no bankruptcy judge, it's code. And so it's worked as engineered extremely well on the DeFi side. And so I just want to make sure that these three pots were kind of defined in a way, because we're in the front end of a massive, kind of step change in finance on how people leverage, get yield, and participate in these DeFi networks. And it's a really important moment in time for us where, as builders, this is like a pressure testing moment. And from a DeFi standpoint, I'm extremely proud of how certain DeFi protocols have performed in this market because they got pressure tested. This is what we want to see.
So I noticed you said the engineering failed in the Terra Luna situation.
Well, yeah, it did as it meant to, actually. You're right.
I don't know if the engineering failed. I think it goes back to the risk management, and so the first phase of DeFi, call it DeFi 1.0, what we really saw was it was a great spark from entrepreneurs, engineers, and coders. And what we've gotten is good. We have good primitives, we have a structure, and the actual DeFi protocols actually worked and didn't have halt withdrawals or anything. But a lot of DeFi people, the entrepreneurs, need to understand financial systems better, and therefore how risk management should be done and how things can be set up. The biggest problems with a lot of lending and borrowing type of applications is you are using crypto assets and over collateralizing, which is good in one sense but bad in other, in order to lend and borrow. So what happens is it becomes very reflexive. So you're not, if you want to grow DeFi for 2.0 to get it really big, you have to have more traditional people come over to use it. And that means you can't be whales existing in DeFi, loaning or collateralizing your assets in an over collateralized fashion. So to do that, you actually need better on-chain identity while preserving privacy so that you can do credit scores, et cetera. And you also need to tokenize real-world assets. And that's going to be a movement into DeFi 2.0, I call it, or phase 2. And you're going to really have teams, just like a venture capitalist uses, where there is like engineering and a visionary with domain expertise for financial services people to structure the economic mechanism much better. It's not just necessarily the code failing. The code actually worked.
But how have you seen that institutional interest grow, dissipate, mature over the period of these last few months where it has been rocky? Because I assume probably like prior to Bitcoin hitting its peak in November, DeFi interest from institutionals were like sky high, and now probably there's a little bit of cooling off.
So from the institutional side, it's actually continued to grow. This has had zero effect. You see it every single day. You see, JP Morgan coin still working out there. The Monetary Authority of Singapore, DBS, and JP Morgan are working on Project Guardian, which is a wholesale lending tokenization in order to create a DeFi for institutional product. Citibank just assigned a custodian. SocGen is doing things with MakerDAO. The volume of calls I get as an operator from institutions and financial services are all increasing. And that's just from the institutional side. From the individual side, again, marrying great domain expertise with coders, the people who work for people in this room are all still making the shift and having great ideas on how to create new primitives that can advance the entire ecosystem. So I think it's very important that everyone here pays attention to DeFi, especially DeFi 2.0, because otherwise you'll get left behind because it's still moving.
And I agree with that. I think there's some people that have their heads in the sand now to say, hey, everything going on in crypto is bad, and and kind of kick the can down the road. I agree with John. The undercurrent of market participants, institutional market participants coming into DeFi is very strong. And what's happening now in DeFi is that there's a fork in the road. As builders, as if you're running a protocol or an application, there's two worlds developing. One is the decentralized finance, permissionless version of this as we know it today. And then there's a photocopy version, so the same smart contracts, the same logic, getting ported over, but now they're permissioned. So everybody's KYC'd, everybody's AML, there's JP Morgan knowing, Goldman Sachs knowing, Citibank are on this chain and they're lending. These primitives are getting exercised and developed and thought through now. And so now we have this $80 billion market going to several trillion, and we have this centralized permission one. And it's going to be interesting to see how these two over time converge or kind of interoperate with each other. So that's kind of what's happening behind the scenes in DeFi on the institutional front. They're not comfortable necessarily putting money on the permissionless, but they are very anxious to figure out this permission version.
Because, I mean, Mary Catherine, my idea for this is, would you call that DeFi, basically? Does institutions getting involved in DeFi actually make it not decentralized anymore?
Not necessarily. So I do think part of the benefit of DeFi and the permissionless system, so for example, and I'll keep using Uniswap as an example, is that when you can have so many different participants, you can have, in the case of an exchange, like greater market depth than even the centralized exchanges. So the challenge in making the transition that was just described is how do you then not fragment liquidity? So the photocopied systems that have been developed so far haven't gotten massive adoption because they've had too few participants, or they have, in the case of a lending protocol, lots of lending demand, lending supply, very little borrowing demand. And the borrowing demand in many of the DeFi protocols comes from people who frankly kind of need the permissionless context in order to participate. And so I do agree that the institutional interest, actually, we've seen it be even stronger in the past few months, I think in part because there's less distraction from trading strategies, market volatility. We're sort of reaching a little bit of a stability point right now in July. And so we've seen a lot of interest in how can we bridge the benefits of DeFi protocols and the technology, but also the needs that John described, which is like on-chain identity, knowing who your counterparty is. So I don't think that just because you have more identity information doesn't mean something's not decentralized. That doesn't necessarily change the way that the technology operates or the way that like critical decisions and evolutions in the technology are made. So for example, I think that there's an opportunity with DeFi to have even better identity management. There's more transparency. There's more information that you instantly have. And so I think part of what's unfortunate about some of the regulatory dialogue right now is that rather than talking about how this is an opportunity for better investor protection, for better disclosure, for better KYC and AML, we instead are just focused on some of what's already existed. And it's really an opportunity, I think, to have a much better series of regulatory solutions.
Yeah, and kind of moving on to regulation as well, we've seen a few things popping up across the globe as this crisis has unfolded, particularly focusing on things like stablecoins, which are probably easier for regulators to understand because they operate slightly more similar to fiat currency and banking institutions. DeFi has largely been left out of that. How do you think that that is going to affect DeFi's chances in coming out of this crypto winter a stronger group when regulators are largely ignoring it for the most part at this point?
Well, I don't think DeFi is actually left out of it because you just mentioned stablecoins, and I think most of the panelists before said stablecoins are one of the most urgent areas that they want to regulate. And stablecoins are actually the lubricant that makes DeFi work. So it is not left out of it from that perspective. Also, I think what's important is we need to figure out global standards. OFAC is the one thing that is global, but for accreditation and other things, it's different rules, different geographies. And how do you have a truly global system if every region, every country has different rules? That's something we still have to figure out.
Are you hearing anything from regulators on your guys' side about how they're seeing DeFi protocols in future regulation?
Yeah, regulating DeFi is hard. I mean, it's putting yourself in the shoes of the regulator. It's hard to figure out how to put this into a box, right? And you look at the regulatory framework here in the U.S. Bitcoin's got clarity. Ethereum, maybe some adjacent clarity, but there's not that much clarity in the space here in the United States. A lot of the enforcement actions have kind of created some more confusion than clarity, and so I think with the executive order that came out of the White House and basically promoting responsible innovation and figuring this stuff out versus being very prescriptive to say CFTC, SEC, Treasury, do these things. It was more like study this technology, it's important, it's going to change the fabric of finance, and get on this. And that was an important piece in my mind, because being prescriptive is, I think, hard and detrimental to innovation. So it's a process, and we're still in the super early days. Well, we're in a crypto winter. This market is here to stay, and it's going to grow like crazy. And so I think responsible innovation with a way to let these rails, these railroads, these protocols grow, and then decide how to figure out how to regulate it is a better approach. But it's hard to do that today with the agendas they have, their to-do list generally, and then they see this nascent industry that's kind of nipping at the heels of broader finance. It kind of is the last priority for them. It keeps going up in priority every single month and day since Bitcoin started, but it's still tough for them to put it into a rubric that is familiar.
I would agree. It's a totally new paradigm for financial services regulation. So if you think about how we regulate transmission of information or the internet, we don't regulate SMTP, email protocol. We regulate the applications on top of it that create risk, that are where somebody's going to get phished or scammed. And so I think it makes sense for us to move to a paradigm where that's similar in the case of DeFi, where you're not regulating underlying protocols or open source code, but you are regulating and thinking about the right investor protections at the interface layers, the application layer. But I think that regulators are, and that's a whole mindset shift for a financial services regulator who's used to finding who is the central intermediary that I can hold accountable and what rules do I impose on them, how do I force them to give me information. I do think regulators are educating themselves on it, though. I know in the past 2 months, we had 2 CFTC commissioners reach out to us and come by our office just to learn about how decentralized market structure can create more stable liquidity and ultimately fare better in times like this. So I'm optimistic. I think it will take time because it's so different, but I am optimistic that we'll come to a pretty good outcome.
And so what happens in markets between like holding our breath, waiting for clarity, is markets start to self-regulate a little bit, just to say, hey, these are best practices, these are do's and don'ts. Even when you deposit money into a DeFi primitive, there should be stratification of risk, whether that's aggressive because it's got a high yield, or it's conservative because it goes through AVA and Uniswap and Compound, and these are all wall clock tested protocols, have liquidity, et cetera, so they're more conservative. So I think striping some of these protocols in terms of a risk spectrum, which wouldn't come from a regulator, would come from the industry, I think would be a mindful kind of outcome on some of these standards. Vesper, our DeFi protocol, has been audited independently 50 times. Our next competitor was audited 3 or 4 times. So audits, clarity on risk, I think all these things that we could do as an industry can improve the dialogue once regulators get their arms around this.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned self-regulation there, and if we think back to what Novogratz was talking about this morning, he said self-regulation was the thing that was meant to be the thing keeping the industry in check for the last few months, and actually has so far, in some cases, not been the thing that has held things up, and that's why we've seen these massive increases in counterparty risk. How do you think that self-regulation conversation is going? Because that's really been the go-to for industry so far.
Definitely improving, and like Mike said earlier, there are certain chains already that disclose, founders and C-level people who sell. So it is definitely moving towards that, but we need more guidance.
And then kind of finally, as well as a forecast, like how do you think DeFi is going to look in the next year? Are we going to see more pain in the markets to come, or is there going to be kind of a mellowing out? I know, Mary Catherine, you mentioned a sort of stability period at this point.
Well, it's not like it was in May, so it's certainly different, I'm optimistic that we'll see a lot of exciting innovation. So I don't know if we'll see growth in retail users, but I do think that like institutional partnerships are going to pick up. I think that we'll see more examples of creative approaches to identity and KYC on chain that aren't just permission pools. I think we'll see cool ways to flag risk at the user level. So because there's so much information on chain, you could start to, players like Uniswap could flag red, yellow, green, the level of risk in the tokens. I think we'll see the emergence of identity solutions, risk management solutions, and a bunch of exciting stuff that will make the whole ecosystem feel safer. So hopefully, in a year from now, it looks pretty different and it's more evident how this is the future of finance.
And Matt, with the merge also being on the horizon, how are you seeing that play into your future forecasts for DeFi?
I mean, we're kind of 2 years into the DeFi odyssey as we sit here from the DeFi summer 24 months ago. And I see a bright future for DeFi. We're in this kind of lull here. But a lot of the assumptions for the utility of DeFi have been proven out 100x. Where we go from here with the merge, everything else, I think that will catalyze. I think a lot of people are staking on ETH, getting a yield. It's a DeFi primitive of sorts, and I think that will continue to create a flywheel of interest and adoption. If I'm an institution, what's my baby step today? I'm buying Ethereum or Avalanche or some kind of layer 1 tech, and I'm staking it, and I'm actually earning a yield. So you are making money on your money. That's a good first baby step in this space. After that, then you're like, okay, maybe I should optimize this yield, or maybe I should take a loan out against my principal. And so that's kind of the staircase stepping of a lot of people that come into DeFi. But Ethereum and the merge and the crypto economics around that, the incentives, I think are a good catalyst for institutions to baby step their way into crypto.
Anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from January to call it May, if you look at the large basket of cryptocurrencies, it was 75.75 correlation to the S&P. And come May, it dropped because of idiosyncratic stuff to like less than 50, 0.45. We have, I think, troughed the idiosyncratic stuff. Maybe there's a few more things left, and we're going to go back to 0.75-ish to aggressive growth assets like SaaS companies or internet companies. And then where the macro goes, I don't think anyone in this room can actually predict that.